I hadn't been back to the Carver estate in over a year, yet the place looked like something torn from a glossy magazine spread. Every inch gleamed fresh paint on the grand columns, polished marble floors, crystal chandeliers casting golden light across the ballroom. It was the kind of opulence meant to impress the city's oldest families. And it worked. Laughter and polite applause floated over the hum of the string quartet. I stood near the far wall, as far from the spotlight as possible. The beige silk dress Margaret had chosen for me hung stiff against my frame. The fabric cool and unyielding, understated elegance she'd called it when she dropped it off at my apartment. I knew what she really meant. Don't stand out. Don't give anyone a reason to remember you were here. Emma moved through the crowd with practiced grace. Her hand looped through her husband's arm. They looked like they belonged on the cover of some society wedding issue, all charm and synchronized smiles. I caught her eye once, but she quickly looked past me to greet a councilman's wife. It wasn't anger exactly. It was distance, the kind you build brick by brick until it feels permanent. Margaret floated nearby in a silver gown, her voice bright, her laugh sharper than it needed to be. She placed a possessive hand on my father's arm as she spoke to a small group, and I noticed how easily his expression bent to her cues, the same way it had for years. A waiter appeared at my side, offering a champagne flute. I took it without thinking, though I'd barely touched alcohol in months. The glass was cold against my fingers, the pale gold liquid catching the light as if it belonged here more than I did. I stayed near the edge of the crowd, sipping slowly, watching my family hold court in a house that used to feel like mine. The music swelled for the next toast, and I felt the urge to leave the room to slip into one of the quiet hallways where the noise couldn't follow. I told myself I just needed air, a moment away from the perfect suffocating picture. I didn't yet realize that a single step out of the ballroom would change everything. I let one of my father's cousins corner me near the dessert table. She was mid-story about her new lake house when it hit subtle at first, just a faint drift in my balance. Then the edges of the room softened, the chandelier lights blurring into hazy halos. I tightened my grip on the champagne flute. Though I hadn't even finished half of it, I'd been careful, sipping slowly, spacing each taste between long pauses. This wasn't alcohol. I knew my body well enough to tell the difference. The cousin's voice faded into the background, the words flattening into sound without meaning. My pulse thudded in my ears. I forced a smile, murmured something about checking on the coat room, and stepped away. The floor felt uneven beneath my heels as I moved through the crowd, careful not to draw attention. My eyes darted once toward Margaret, still holding court laughter bright and flawless as if nothing in the world could shake her. I set the glass down on a passing waiter's tray. The stem slipped from my fingers easier than it should have. The cool air from the hallway beyond the ballroom brushed my skin, and I followed it like a lifeline. The noise dimmed with every step into the back corridor. My breathing slowed, though the odd fog in my head lingered. I told myself it was nothing, a skipped lunch, the heat from the crowd, but the thought didn't land. That last sip had tasted slightly bitter, almost metallic. I reached the end of the hall, one hand against the wall for balance, trying to steady myself before anyone saw. The kitchen doors swung open just ahead, releasing a burst of clattering dishes and the smell of butter and herbs. I stepped toward them, hoping for a chair, maybe a glass of water. Instead, someone was waiting for me. The clatter of pans and low hum of kitchen chatter filled the space, a stark contrast to the curated elegance of the ballroom. I barely had time to scan the room before a man stepped away from a stack of folded linens and crossed to me. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with sharp eyes that caught and held mine. His voice was steady, pitched low so it wouldn't carry. Lila Carver. I hesitated. Yes, I'm Jack Harper, he said. Security for the venue tonight, but years ago I worked for Carver and Partners, your mother's firm. Something in my chest tightened at the mention of my mother. But before I could ask, he leaned in slightly, the weight of his words deliberate. Margaret put something in your drink. I saw it. I stared at him, the kitchen noise dulling to a hum. But she slipped a small capsule out of her clutch, dropped it in, gave it one stir, and it dissolved. Looked like nothing happened, but I've been in this line of work long enough to know what I saw. My pulse quickened. "You're sure I wouldn't be standing here if I wasn't?" he said. Then, as if sensing my instinct to run, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. "If you can switch glasses, make it look like an accident, but don't drink from yours again. Whatever's in there, it's not for celebration." I took the card. The embossed letters felt heavier than paper should. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I knew your mother," he said simply, "and she'd want someone watching your back." He didn't wait for me to answer, just gave a short nod and moved toward the service hallway, disappearing into the hum of the kitchen. I stood there gripping the card, my mind a knot of disbelief and clarity. Jack's words had stripped the party of its pretense. Somewhere in that glittering ballroom, my stepmother was smiling, certain she'd already won. I turned toward the doorway, ready to find my way back. The noise of the ballroom hit me like a wave when I stepped back through the double doors. For a moment, it felt unreal. People laughing, crystal glasses catching the light, the quartet's gentle music wrapping it all in a picture-perfect frame. I tightened my grip on Jack's card in my palm before slipping it into my clutch. Margaret stood across the room, her profile angled toward a photographer. She tilted her head just enough to show the silver earrings that matched her gown. Lips parted in a practiced laugh. My father hovered beside her, beaming at something the man behind the camera had said. My gaze fell to the table in front of them. 2 champagne flutes sat side by side, the stems catching the light. They were nearly identical down to the fine bubbles clinging to the glass. My own flute, the one Jack had warned me about, waited innocently near my chair. The path between us felt impossibly long, but the crowd gave me cover. Waiters moving with trays, guests shifting in conversation. I reached my table as if I were simply returning from the restroom, sliding into place without pause. Margaret was still laughing, leaning toward the photographer. I rose again almost immediately, lifting both glasses in one smooth motion, as though I couldn't remember which was mine. My heart thudded in my ears. I set one down in front of my seat, the one I'd taken from Margaret's place, and carried the other to her side. "Here," I said lightly, placing it in front of her. She didn't even glance at me, just murmured a distracted thank you before turning back to the lens. I returned to my seat, resting my hands loosely in my lap. Outwardly, I was calm, composed, another guest enjoying the evening. Inside my pulse was a drumbeat, each thud counting down to whatever would happen next. I lifted my gaze toward the head table just as my father stood tapping his glass for attention. The clinking of glassware rippled through the room as my father rose, his hand resting on the back of Margaret's chair. His voice carried with the easy authority of a man used to attention. He spoke about love, loyalty, and legacy-weaving phrases he'd used at every anniversary celebration I could remember. Margaret sat beside him, her posture perfect, her smile fixed. Then, almost deliberately, she reached for the champagne flute I'd placed in front of her. She lifted it with the poise of someone about to seal a performance, her gaze sweeping the room before settling on me. It was the smallest flicker of a smile, confident, certain, that passed over her face before she tilted her head and drank. I held her gaze, not blinking. The toast continued applause starting around the room, but something in Margaret's expression shifted. Her smile twitched, then froze. The hand holding the glass trembled slightly before the stem slipped from her grip. It hit the floor and shattered, sending golden liquid across the parquet. She swayed once as if the room had tilted beneath her, and my father's hand darted toward her shoulder before he could steady her. She crumpled. The fall wasn't graceful. Her knees hit first, then her side, and she landed in a heap, breath sharp and shallow. The room erupted. Emma pushed past a table of guests, her gown catching on a chair leg. Waiters stumbled with trays. Silverware clattered. Someone shouted for an ambulance. A chorus of voices rose, all layered with confusion and alarm. I stayed in my seat. My hands folded neatly in my lap. My pulse was steady now. I knew exactly what had just happened. That glass had been meant for me. And now, under the bright lights of the ballroom in front of more than 100 witnesses, Margaret was the one gasping for breath. My father knelt beside her, calling her name, his voice cracking. Emma hovered close, pressing a napkin into Margaret's hand, even though it was useless against whatever was in her system. The sound of sirens grew louder outside, a thin wail that cut through the chaos. Red and blue light began to flash against the tall windows as the paramedics approached. The police arrived before the last shard of glass was swept from the floor. Uniformed officers moved through the crowd, guiding guests toward the foyer to take statements. I stayed where I was until a woman in a dark blazer approached her badge, catching the light. Detective Sarah Collins. She said, her tone measured. She took a seat across from me, flipping open a small notebook. Her eyes lingered a second too long on my face, as if searching for something. "You don't seem rattled," she observed. "I process things differently," I replied, keeping my voice even. She asked where I'd been sitting, how close I was to Margaret, whether I'd noticed anything unusual. I answered carefully, neither volunteering nor denying. When she thanked me and moved on, I could feel her watching me, even as she spoke to the next guest. The next morning, my phone rang. The number was blocked. "This is Detective Collins," the voice said. "We'd like you to come in at the station." The walls were the color of wet sand, the air faintly metallic. Collins sat across from me with a folder closed between her hands. "We got the toxicology report," she began. "Scopolamine, small dose, but enough to cause disorientation, fainting, possible memory loss in higher amounts. Worse." I met her gaze. "I believe it." Her brow lifted. "You believe it?" "Yes, because I was supposed to drink that glass." The room seemed to pause. "Explain," she said. I told her about Jack Harper, the warning in the kitchen, and how I'd switched the glasses. I didn't dress it up. I let the facts stand. She listened without interruption, her expression unreadable. "That's a serious accusation," she said finally. "If it's true, it changes everything." I leaned back in the chair. "It is true." Her fingers tapped the folder once, then stilled. "Then we'll need more than your word." I already knew where I'd get it. 2 months before the anniversary party, an envelope arrived at my apartment. The return address was from an old brick building in downtown Charleston, my mother's attorney's office. I hadn't heard from them since her estate had been settled, so the sight of their letterhead pulled something tight in my chest. Inside was a single-page letter and a photocopy of a legal document. The letter explained that while reviewing archived files, they'd come across a clause in my parents' prenuptial agreement. I scanned the dense paragraphs until my eyes caught on the part that changed everything. If my father remarried, his new spouse would be barred from inheriting anything connected to my mother's assets, her property's investments, or residual trusts. Those rights would pass directly to me. I read it 3 times, barely breathing. It wasn't just protection. It was a locked door with my mother's name on the key, and Margaret had been standing on the other side for years, assuming the door would open for her. I didn't tell anyone. Not at first, but a week later, I made a call to an old family friend asking questions I thought were private. I should have known better. Conversations in my family never stayed in one place. Soon after the invitations began. Dinner at the estate brunch with just the girls. Even Emma's anniversary party events I'd been excluded from for years. Margaret started complimenting my clothes, my hair, my poise. It was too much too sudden and too obviously rehearsed. She hadn't softened toward me. She'd adjusted her aim. The night of the party, when she handed me that beige dress, she was smiling as though she'd finally decided to let me in. But the truth was sharper than that. Margaret wasn't opening a door. She was building a trap. And by the time I saw it for what it was, I was already standing in the middle of it. Margaret didn't waste time. 3 days after the party, a glossy local lifestyle blog ran an exclusive interview with her. The headline called her a pillar of the community who had been targeted by her troubled stepdaughter. The article quoted her at length how she'd suffered a frightening medical episode, how she'd always tried to welcome me despite my resentment over her marriage to my father. She never mentioned the toxicology report. She never mentioned Jack. And she certainly didn't mention the clause in the prenup. The comments were brutal. People who'd never met me filled the thread with armchair diagnoses, accusing me of jealousy, greed, and worse. It was the kind of public narrative Margaret excelled at, polished, emotional, just believable enough for people who wanted a villain. That evening, my phone rang. Jack's name lit the screen. I got something he said without preamble. Pulled the kitchen footage from the security archive before it could be wiped. Within the hour, he was at my apartment with a flash drive. The video was grainy but clear. Margaret standing at the bar, glancing over her shoulder, pulling something from her clutch and dropping it into a glass. One stir and it vanished. There was more. A clip of her leaning toward a server, whispering something before he hurried off. Jack told me the man hadn't returned after the collapse. No one had been able to contact him. "This isn't just speculation anymore," Jack said. "It's proof." I knew better than to take it to the same outlets Margaret had charmed. Instead, I called a small independent journalist I trusted. I gave her the footage, the timestamps, and Jack's statement. By the next morning, the video was online. No commentary, no sensational headline, just the truth frame by frame. And within hours, the tide began to turn. By the second day, the video had spread beyond Charleston. The tone of the whispers shifted: less gossip, more condemnation. 2 nonprofit boards quietly removed Margaret's name from their rosters. A boutique she co-owned scrubbed her photo from its website. Her smile, once currency, had turned into a liability. My phone rang late in the afternoon. My father's voice was strained, stripped of the easy warmth he reserved for public moments. "Lila, we need to talk tomorrow at the house." When I arrived, the air inside felt colder than I remembered. Margaret wasn't there. My father sat at the dining table, a folder in front of him. "She's gone," he said. "Left last night. I don't know where. I didn't sit. Here's what I want. A public acknowledgement of the truth. Margaret out of my mother's house and every asset tied to her estate returned to me without delay." He looked at me for a long moment, then opened the folder. Inside were signed transfer documents restoring my legal claim to the property's investments and trust my mother had built. "You win," he said quietly. "I should have protected you." It wasn't an apology. It was a statement of fact offered too late to matter. I took the folder, the weight of it solid in my hands. "You could have," I said. His eyes flickered downward. "What happens now is up to you." I didn't answer. I had what I came for, and the rest, how the story would end, was already taking shape. Within a week, the keys to my mother's house were back in my hand. The first thing I did was walk through every room, opening the drapes to let the light in. I pulled family photos from storage and set them back on the mantels where Margaret had replaced them with her own. The garden, choked with weeds under her watch, was cleared and replanted bit by bit. I returned the house to what it had been, a place that belonged to us, not her. Weeks later, Emma came by. She stood in the doorway, eyes flicking over the restored photographs and the blooming roses outside. She didn't step far inside. Her voice was soft, uncertain. "I don't know what to believe anymore." I didn't argue. Belief was her burden, not mine. After she left, Jack called. "She's keeping a low profile," he said. "No board seats, no public appearances. The people she counted on aren't returning her calls." I thanked him. He didn't ask for details about what I'd do next, and I didn't offer any. There were no press statements, no interviews. I didn't post triumphant photos or leak new rumors. I let the footage, the documents, and the silence do their work. The damage was already in motion, and nothing I could say would make it sharper. Some victories don't need applause. I sat on the back porch one evening, the scent of fresh soil in the air, and watched the light fade over the garden my mother planted. The house was mine again. But more than that, it was safe. I'd survived. And that more than any headline or public reckoning was enough. Lila learns the power of quiet resilience and strategic timing. Faced with her stepmother Margaret's betrayal, she doesn't react impulsively or seek public vindication. Instead, she uses Jack's warning and the prenuptial clause to outmaneuver Margaret, reclaiming her mother's legacy without fanfare. Her measured response, switching the glasses, securing evidence, and letting the truth unfold, shows that victory doesn't require loud triumphs or vengeance. By restoring her mother's house and garden, Lila finds peace in reclaiming her past, proving that enduring strength and calculated silence can dismantle even the most carefully constructed traps.
The morning sun streamed through the stained glass windows of St. Mary's Cathedral, casting rainbow patterns across the polished marble floors as I adjusted my daughter Sophia's christening gown. At 6 months old, she was perfect: dark hair, bright eyes, and a smile that could melt the coldest heart. Today was supposed to be about celebrating her entrance into our faith community, but I could already feel the familiar tension building as my extended family filed into the pews. "Isabella, darling." My Aunt Carmen's voice carried across the sanctuary, dripping with false sweetness. "So good of you to choose such a prestigious venue for little Sophia's christening." I smoothed Sophia's white silk gown and smiled politely. "Thank you for coming, Aunt Carmen." Carmen surveyed the cathedral with obvious approval. The soaring Gothic arches, the hand-carved altar, the magnificent pipe organ that had been imported from Germany. St. Mary's was the most beautiful church in the city, and everyone knew it came with a waiting list and substantial donation requirements. "I have to admit," Carmen continued, "I was surprised when you said you'd managed to book St. Mary's. Father Rodriguez is very selective about christenings here." Behind her, my cousins Maria and Elena nodded knowingly. They'd both had their children christened at smaller parishes, claiming the intimate atmosphere was more meaningful. The truth was, none of them could afford St. Mary's donation requirements. "Isabella must have connections," Elena said, bouncing her 2-year-old son on her hip. "Maybe through Sophia's father's family?" I kept my expression neutral. Sophia's father hadn't been part of our lives since I told him I was pregnant. My family knew this, but they preferred to speculate about mysterious benefactors rather than give me credit for anything. "Or maybe," Maria added with a smirk, "someone took pity on the poor single mother." The familiar shame washed over me. Even on my daughter's christening day, I was the family charity case in their eyes, the one who'd gotten pregnant without marriage, who worked multiple jobs to make ends meet, who lived in a small apartment instead of the suburban houses my cousins had acquired through strategic marriages. "Isabella." My mother's voice interrupted the speculation as she hurried over, carrying an armload of flowers. "These are beautiful, Mija. Where did you get them?" I'd arranged for white roses and baby's breath, simple but elegant arrangements that complemented the cathedral's natural beauty. "I ordered them from the florist." "Which florist?" Carmen demanded. "These look expensive." "Rivera's on 5th Street. Carmen's eyebrows shot up. "Rivera's?" "Isabella, those arrangements must have cost." "They're lovely," I interrupted gently. "That's what matters." Father Rodriguez appeared at my elbow, his kind face beaming with genuine warmth. "Isabella, everything looks perfect. Are you ready to begin?" "Yes, Father. Thank you for accommodating our family." "The pleasure is entirely mine," he said, his eyes twinkling. "Sophia is blessed to have such a devoted mother." Carmen stepped forward, inserting herself into the conversation. "Father Rodriguez, we're so grateful you made room for our family in your schedule. St. Mary's is such a prestigious parish." Father Rodriguez smiled diplomatically. "All children are welcome in God's house, Mrs. Carmen Valdez. I'm Isabella's aunt." She puffed up with self-importance. "I've been a member of St. Catherine's for 23 years. My husband serves on the parish council." "How wonderful. Community involvement is so important." Carmen preened under his attention. "We believe in supporting our church. Substantial tithing, volunteer work, leadership roles. That's what real faith looks like." I saw Father Rodriguez's smile tighten slightly, but he remained gracious. "Well," Carmen continued, "I should find my seat. Thank you again for making this possible for Isabella. I know accommodations like this aren't usually made for families in her situation." "Families in her situation?" Father Rodriguez's tone grew cooler. "You know," Carmen lowered her voice conspiratorially, "single mothers, limited means. It's charitable of you to be so inclusive." The temperature in the sanctuary seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Mrs. Valdez," Father Rodriguez said carefully, "all families are welcome at St. Mary's, regardless of their circumstances." Carmen nodded approvingly. "Of course. Though I imagine the donation requirements help maintain standards." I felt my cheeks burning with embarrassment. Even here in this sacred space on my daughter's special day, Carmen couldn't resist reminding everyone of my perceived inadequacies. Other family members had gathered nearby. My uncle Roberto, my cousins, their spouses and children. They formed a semicircle around us, listening to every word. "Tia Carmen," I said quietly, "perhaps we should take our seats." "In a moment, dear." Carmen was just getting started. "Father Rodriguez, I wanted to ask, How does the church typically handle christenings for families who can't meet the usual donation guidelines? Do you have special programs for the less fortunate? My mother looked mortified. Carmen, please. What? I'm just curious about the church's charitable outreach. Isabella's done remarkably well arranging all this. Carmen gestured at the flowers, the cathedral, the gathered family. Though I imagine she had help. What kind of help? Father Rodriguez asked, his voice gaining an edge. Financial assistance. Sponsorship. Someone must have helped cover the costs because frankly on Isabella's salary. Carmen trailed off with a meaningful look. The silence that followed was deafening. Mrs. Valdez, Father Rodriguez said slowly, I think there may be some misunderstanding. You don't belong here, Carmen hissed suddenly, turning to face me directly. This is for respectable families. Families who can afford proper ceremonies, proper donations, proper lives for their children. The words hit like physical blows. Around us, my family shifted uncomfortably, but no one defended me. You're embarrassing our family, Carmen continued, her voice low but vicious. Parading around in a cathedral you can't afford, pretending you belong with decent people. Sophia started to fuss in my arms, sensing the tension. I held her closer, my heart breaking that her christening day was being poisoned by such cruelty. I'm sorry, I whispered to Father Rodriguez. I didn't mean for. Don't apologize, he said firmly, his eyes flashing with anger. Mrs. Valdez, I think you need to reconsider your words. I'm speaking the truth, Carmen declared. Isabella needs to accept her place in life instead of reaching beyond her means. Father Rodriguez looked around at my assembled family members, none of whom had spoken up to defend me. His expression was one of profound disappointment. Perhaps, he said loudly, his voice carrying across the sanctuary, before we begin the christening ceremony, I should make an announcement. The entire cathedral fell silent. I want to ensure everyone understands the significance of this day, and the generosity that has made this celebration possible. Carmen straightened, clearly expecting praise for her realistic assessment of the situation. Before we begin, Father Rodriguez announced, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling, let's thank Ms. Martinez for donating this beautiful church. The silence that followed was absolute. Carmen's prayer book slipped from her fingers and hit the marble floor with a sharp crack that echoed through the cathedral. 3 years ago, Father Rodriguez continued, when St. Mary's Cathedral was facing demolition due to structural damage and the archdiocese's financial constraints, Isabella Martinez stepped forward with a $28 million donation to not only save the building but completely restore it to its original glory. Every person in the sanctuary turned to stare at me. Carmen's mouth was hanging open. The stained glass windows you see were restored under Isabella's direction. The pipe organ was rebuilt with her funding. The marble floors, the carved altar, the Gothic arches, all preserved because of her generous heart. Sophia had stopped fussing and was looking around with wide, curious eyes, as if sensing something important was happening. Isabella didn't just donate money, Father Rodriguez continued. She donated her time, her expertise, and her vision. She worked with architects and craftsmen to ensure every detail honored the cathedral's heritage while making it accessible for future generations. He gestured toward the beautiful space surrounding us. She insisted on one condition, that her donation remain anonymous. She wanted no recognition, no naming rights, no public acknowledgement. She simply wanted to preserve this sacred space for our community. Carmen was staring at me like I'd grown a second head. Mrs. Valdez, Father Rodriguez said, his voice carrying a note of steel, when you asked about our policies for families with limited means, you were standing in a cathedral that exists because of Isabella's generosity. When you questioned whether she belongs here, you were questioning whether the woman who saved this church belongs in the building she rescued. The silence was deafening. I'm sharing this now, Father Rodriguez continued, because I will not allow anyone to suggest that this remarkable woman and her beautiful daughter don't belong in God's house, especially not in the house that Isabella saved. Roberto was the first to find his voice. Isabella, you donated $28 million? I nodded quietly, still holding Sophia close. But, how? Maria stammered. You work at that nonprofit, you live in the small apartment. I work at Martinez Foundation, I corrected gently. My nonprofit. We focus on historic preservation and community development. Carmen finally closed her mouth, but her eyes remained wide with shock. The small apartment, I continued, is actually a penthouse I designed myself. I prefer minimalist living, but it's in the building I own downtown. Elena shifted her son to her other hip, looking confused. You own a building? I own several buildings. Real estate development has been very good to me. Father Rodriguez smiled warmly. Isabella has also funded the restoration of 4 other historic churches in our diocese, along with 3 community centers and the new Children's Hospital wing. Children's Hospital wing? My mother whispered. The pediatric cancer ward, I explained. It was important to me that sick children have a beautiful, healing environment. Carmen was shaking her head in disbelief. This is impossible. Isabella, you can't have. Where would you get $28 million? I finished. From Martinez Development Corporation. We specialize in sustainable historic preservation projects. I started the company 8 years ago with money I inherited from Abuela Rosa. The mention of my grandmother's name caused several family members to shift uncomfortably. Abuela Rosa had been the family matriarch, beloved by everyone, except she'd always favored me over her other grandchildren, much to their resentment. Abuela left you money? Carmen's voice cracked. She left me her entire estate. $2.4 million. I used it as seed capital to start my company. $2.4 million? Roberto looked stunned. We never knew. Because I asked the lawyers to keep it private. I didn't want family drama over inheritance. Carmen sat down heavily in the nearest pew. Isabella, how much are you worth now? I looked around at my family members. These people who'd spent years treating me like a charity case, who just moments ago told me I didn't belong in my own cathedral. Currently, about $95 million. The number hung in the air like incense. 95 million, Elena repeated faintly. Give or take. The real estate market fluctuates. Father Rodriguez cleared his throat gently. Perhaps we should proceed with the christening ceremony? Sophia's been very patient. As if on cue, Sophia gurgled happily and reached toward the beautiful stained glass windows, her tiny fingers grasping at the colored light. Yes, I said, smiling down at my daughter. Let's welcome Sophia into our faith community. The ceremony proceeded beautifully. Father Rodriguez spoke about love, acceptance, and the importance of welcoming all children into God's family. He blessed Sophia with water from the font I'd had restored, carved from Italian marble by the same craftsman who'd worked on the Sistine Chapel. During the service, I noticed my family members glancing at me with new eyes. The same cathedral they'd admired for its prestige was suddenly more impressive knowing I'd saved it. The same flowers they'd questioned were now evidence of my generosity rather than my presumption. After the ceremony, as guests gathered for the reception in the cathedral's restored fellowship hall, Carmen approached me with obvious reluctance. Isabella, she began, I owe you an apology. You do. She winced at my directness. What I said was unforgivable. I had no right to judge you or suggest you didn't belong here. No, you didn't. I don't understand why you didn't tell us. Why let us think you were struggling? I considered the question while Sophia slept peacefully in my arms, surrounded by the cathedral her existence had helped save. Because I wanted to know if you'd love me regardless of my bank account. I wanted to know if you'd support me as a person, not just as a success story. Carmen's face flushed with shame. We failed that test. Spectacularly. How can I make this right? Start by treating me like family instead of charity. Accept that my choices might be different from yours but equally valid. And never again suggest that my daughter doesn't belong somewhere. Carmen nodded, tears in her eyes. I can do that. Other family members approached throughout the reception, offering awkward apologies and asking hesitant questions about my work. I answered honestly but kept the focus on Sophia and the celebration of her christening. As the afternoon wound down, Father Rodriguez pulled me aside. Isabella, I want to thank you again for everything you've done for St. Mary's. Thank you for defending me today. I should have stopped Mrs. Valdez sooner. No one should speak to you that way, especially not in your own cathedral. I smiled. It's not my cathedral, Father. It belongs to the community. That's what makes you remarkable. Most donors would want their name on everything. I don't need my name on buildings. I need buildings to serve their purpose. Sophia stirred in my arms, opening her eyes and looking around the beautiful space with wonder. She's going to grow up knowing this place, Father Rodriguez said softly. Her children might be christened here too. I hope so. That's why I saved it, for future generations. As we prepared to leave, my mother helped me gather Sophia's things. Mija, she said quietly, I'm proud of you. Not because you're wealthy but because you're generous. Because you use your blessings to help others. Thank you, Mama. And I'm sorry we didn't defend you today. We should have stood up to Carmen. You can stand up for me next time. She nodded firmly. There won't be a next time. I'll make sure of it. 3 months later, Carmen called to invite Sophia and me to her grandson's first birthday party. It's nothing fancy, she said quickly. Just family and close friends at the community center. We'd love to come. Isabella, the community center has a new playground. Brand new equipment, very safe and beautiful. I smiled, knowing where this was going. The dedication plaque says it was donated by the Martinez Foundation. Yes. Did you donate that playground? The Martinez Foundation believes every child deserves safe, beautiful places to play. Carmen was quiet for a moment. Thank you. For the playground, for the church, for being a better person than I deserve. Carmen, we're family. Family takes care of family. Even when family doesn't deserve it. Especially then. Sophia's first word was church. She said it while we were visiting St. Mary's for Sunday Mass, pointing at the stained glass windows with delight. I'd been bringing her every week, wanting her to grow up in this beautiful space that had become ours through faith, generosity, and the simple act of belonging somewhere. When Carmen heard about Sophia's first word, she cried. She knows she belongs there, Carmen said. In her church. She belongs everywhere, I corrected gently. And she'll grow up knowing that. Because that's what I'd learned from saving St. Mary's Cathedral. That belonging isn't about what you can afford or what others think you deserve. Belonging is about love, faith, and the courage to stand up for what matters, even when the people who should support you choose cruelty instead. Sophia would grow up in a cathedral her mother had saved, surrounded by family who'd learned to love without conditions. And she would never ever doubt that she belonged exactly where she was. The morning of Marcus's wedding started like every other family gathering in the past 5 years, with a phone call from my mother explaining why I needed to dress appropriately and try not to embarrass the family. I was standing in my hotel room at the Fairmont, looking at the mustard yellow bridesmaid dress Patricia had specifically chosen for me, when Mom called with her final instructions. Emma, sweetheart, I know this is hard for you, she said in that tone she'd perfected, part sympathy, part condescension. Being around all of Marcus's successful friends, seeing Patricia's family with their achievements. Just remember that not everyone can be a doctor or lawyer. I'll keep that in mind, I replied, zipping up the dress that made me look like a diseased banana. And please don't mention your job situation unless someone asks directly. It's Marcus's day and we don't want people feeling uncomfortable. My job situation. That's what the family called it now. Not my career, not my work, my situation. Like it was a medical condition that required delicate handling. The truth was I'd built Anderson Global Logistics into a $4.2 billion supply chain management company that employed over 85,000 people across 47 countries. We handled distribution for 30% of the Fortune 500, had revolutionized cold chain logistics for pharmaceutical companies, and were 3 days away from closing the largest merger in our industry's history. But to my family, I worked at a grocery store. It had started innocuously enough. 7 years ago, when I was building my first distribution center, I'd worked nights at a Safeway to understand every aspect of food retail from the ground up. I wanted to know how products moved from suppliers to shelves, how inventory management worked at the store level, how customer demand patterns shifted. Most executives learn this stuff from spreadsheets and consultants. I learned it by scanning barcodes and stocking shelves from midnight to 6 a.m. When family asked about work during those early years, I'd say I was in food retail or working in supply chain logistics. Somehow this got translated into Emma works at a grocery store, and once that narrative took hold, it was impossible to correct without seeming like I was lying or delusional. The first time I tried to explain what Anderson Global actually did, Uncle Richard had patted my shoulder and said, "That's great, honey. It's good that you're ambitious about your grocery store job." When I mentioned hiring my first 100 employees, Aunt Susan had nodded supportively and said, "Oh, are you managing a department now? That's wonderful progress." Eventually I stopped trying to correct them. It was easier to let them think what they wanted than to deal with their skepticism. And honestly, part of me was curious to see how long they could maintain their delusions about my life. The answer apparently was indefinitely. The rehearsal dinner the night before had been particularly brutal. Patricia's family were genuine achievers. Her father had built a successful construction company. Her brother had just sold his tech startup for $50 million. Her mother was a federal judge. They were warm, accomplished people who clearly expected Marcus's family to be equally impressive. "So Emma," Patricia's brother Jason had asked during cocktails, "Marcus mentioned you work in food service. Are you planning to open your own restaurant?" Before I could answer, Marcus jumped in. "Oh no, Emma's not the entrepreneur type. She works at a grocery store. It's honest work though." The slight pause in conversation was painful. Jason recovered quickly. He was too polite to show his surprise, but I saw Patricia's parents exchange a glance. They were clearly wondering how a family that included doctors, lawyers, and successful business owners had produced someone whose biggest achievement was apparently avoiding unemployment. "Food retail is fascinating," I'd said simply. "The logistics alone are incredibly complex." "I'm sure," Patricia's father had replied kindly, then immediately changed the subject to Marcus's law practice. Later that evening I'd overheard Patricia's mother talking to my mother by the hotel bar. "Patricia mentioned Emma might be a godmother to their children someday," she'd said carefully. "Oh, Emma would love that," Mom had replied. "She's wonderful with kids. Of course, she's not in a position to be much of a financial influence, but she's very loving." Financial influence? Well, she's still finding her way professionally. We help her out when we can. Family takes care of family. But your grandchildren will have plenty of successful role models without needing to worry about Emma's situation. I'd left the bar after that and spent the rest of the evening in my room, reviewing acquisition reports and trying to remember why I'd thought attending this wedding was a good idea. The morning of the ceremony brought fresh humiliations. During hair and makeup, the other bridesmaids, Patricia's sister and 2 college friends, were discussing their careers. One was a pediatric surgeon, another was launching her second startup. The third was a partner at a consulting firm. "And Emma works in grocery," Patricia had explained when they asked about me. "She's been doing that for years now." "Oh," the surgeon had said politely. "That must be stable work." "Very stable," I'd agreed, not mentioning that Anderson Global's stability came from having exclusive contracts with every major food retailer in North America. The conversation had moved on to their vacation plans. Someone's family had a house in the Hamptons, another was planning a month in Europe. When they'd asked about my travel plans, I'd simply said I didn't have any scheduled, rather than explain that I'd be in Singapore next week finalizing a $1.8 billion merger, followed by board meetings in London and a factory opening in Bavaria. The wedding ceremony itself was beautiful. Patricia looked radiant in her grandmother's lace dress, and Marcus seemed genuinely happy. I stood at the altar holding the bridal bouquet, trying to focus on their joy instead of the whispered comments from various relatives about my appearance. "Poor Emma," I'd heard Aunt Susan tell someone behind me. "That color is so unflattering on her. Patricia should have chosen something more appropriate for her complexion." "The dress isn't the problem," someone else had whispered back. "It's the stress. Financial pressure ages you." I'd maintained my smile throughout the ceremony, even when the photographer had positioned me slightly behind the other bridesmaids for the formal photos. "For composition," he'd explained, though everyone understood it was to minimize the visual impact of the family member who didn't quite fit. The reception was held in the Fairmont's Grand Ballroom, a beautiful space that I'd actually considered purchasing 2 years ago before deciding the location wasn't right for my real estate portfolio. The dinner was excellent, though I barely tasted it as I endured toast after toast that somehow managed to celebrate everyone's achievements except mine. "To Patricia's family," Marcus had said, raising his champagne glass. "Judge Whitfield, who's dedicated her life to justice. To Jason, who just sold his company for more money than most of us will see in a lifetime. To Mr. Whitfield, who built his construction empire from nothing." He turned to our side of the room. To my family. Uncle Richard, who just made partner at his accounting firm after 20 years of dedication. To Cousin Derek, who opened his second dental practice this year. To Dr. Patricia's maid of honor Sarah, who's saving lives as a pediatric surgeon. His eyes had found mine during the pause. And to family members who support us in their own special ways. My sister Emma, who flew all the way from Seattle to be here despite the expense. She works in food service, which is honest, necessary work, and we love her for her dedication to simpler values. The applause had been polite but pointed. Several people had looked at me with the kind of gentle sympathy usually reserved for recovering addicts or the recently divorced. It was during the dancing portion that the real drama began. I'd stepped onto the terrace for some air when I overheard a conversation that would change everything. Patricia's mother was speaking with Marcus near the bar, her voice sharp with concern. "Marcus, I need to ask you something directly," she'd said. "Is Emma financially stable? I don't mean to pry, but Patricia mentioned she might want Emma to be godmother to your children, and given her circumstances." "Emma? God, no, she's been struggling for years," Marcus had laughed. "She's sweet, but she can barely take care of herself. She's been working the same grocery store job for 7 years now? Never got promoted, never tried anything else. I think she's just not built for ambition, you know?" Mrs. Whitfield had looked relieved. I was concerned about the influence. Not that there's anything wrong with her work, of course, but Patricia comes from a family of achievers. Her father built his company from nothing, her brother just made $50 million on his startup. We want our grandchildren to have the right kind of role models. "Don't worry about that," Marcus had said. "Emma's basically the family charity case at this point. Mom sends her money for rent sometimes, we all chip in for her car payments. She means well, but she's just not capable of more than she's doing now." That wasn't true. I'd never asked for or received financial help from anyone in my family. But apparently, that was the story they told themselves to make sense of my deliberately modest lifestyle choices. I'd been about to head back inside when I heard Derek's voice from around the corner, talking to some of Patricia's relatives. "Did you see Emma's car in the parking lot?" he was saying. "It's like 15 years old." I actually felt embarrassed for her when the valet had to figure out how to start it. Marcus mentioned she's been using food stamps. Another voice had replied, one of Patricia's cousins, I thought. "It's just sad," Derek had continued. "The whole family is successful except her. My mom thinks she might have some kind of learning disability that was never diagnosed. How else do you explain someone working the same entry-level job for 7 years? At least she seems happy," the cousin had said charitably. "I guess ignorance is bliss," Derek had replied. "She has no idea how far behind she's fallen." I'd heard enough. I'd pulled out my phone and sent a text to David, my head of security, "Ready for pickup." His response had come immediately, 10 minutes. Helicopter fueled and ready. I'd made my way back to the ballroom, planning to say quiet goodbyes and slip away before the evening got worse. But as I'd reached the main table, Marcus had tapped his champagne glass for attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," he'd begun, "I want to take a moment to thank everyone for being here tonight. Patricia and I are so grateful to be surrounded by such successful, accomplished people. Our families represent the absolute best of what hard work and ambition can achieve." He gestured around the room. "We have entrepreneurs who've built million-dollar companies, doctors saving lives, lawyers fighting for justice, executives running major corporations. People who've taken risks, pushed boundaries, refused to settle for less than excellence." His eyes had found mine across the room, and there'd been something almost pitying in his expression. "But we're also grateful for family members who contribute in simpler ways. My sister Emma flew all the way from Seattle to be here tonight, even though I know the cost was probably difficult for her budget. She works in food service, which is honest, humble work. Not everyone can be a CEO or a surgeon, and that's perfectly okay." The applause had been polite but condescending. Several people had looked at me with the kind of sympathy usually reserved for someone announcing a terminal diagnosis. "Emma represents something important," Marcus had continued, warming to his theme. "In a world obsessed with achievement and status, she reminds us that there's dignity in simple work, value in modest goals. She's content with her life, and that's actually quite admirable." Patricia's father had stood up, clearly feeling generous after several glasses of wine. "To Emma," he'd called out. for showing us that happiness doesn't require success. The room had raised their glasses to me like I was some kind of inspirational poster about overcoming limitations. I could see pity in their eyes, mixed with relief that their own children had turned out so much better. That's when my phone had buzzed. "Miss Anderson?" The voice belonged to a tall man in an impeccable black suit who had somehow appeared beside me without anyone noticing. David Martinez looked exactly like what he was, former Secret Service, trained to handle threats to world leaders, now dedicated to protecting one of Seattle's most valuable executives. "I'm David Martinez, your head of security," he'd continued, his voice carrying just far enough for nearby tables to hear. "I apologize for the interruption, but we have an urgent situation that requires your immediate attention." The conversations around us had stopped. David had the kind of presence that commanded rooms, 6 feet 2 inches of professional alertness and expensive suits. "Security," Mrs. Whitfield had repeated, looking confused. "The helicopter is waiting on the roof," David had continued smoothly. "Your 9 p.m. conference call with the Singapore team cannot be delayed. The Chin Industries merger closes Monday morning, and the Tokyo markets open in 3 hours. The board is waiting for your final approval on the $1.8 billion acquisition." Marcus's champagne glass had slipped from his hand, shattering on the marble floor. "I'm sorry to cut this short," I'd said, standing and smoothing down the terrible mustard dress. "I tried to keep business separate from family time, but unfortunately international markets don't respect wedding schedules." "Emma, what the hell is going on?" Marcus had grabbed my arm, his voice cracking slightly. David had stepped closer, not threateningly, but with the kind of professional readiness that made it clear he was prepared for any situation. "Sir, I'll need you to step back from Ms. Anderson." "Miss Anderson?" Patricia's voice had been barely a whisper. I'd looked around the room at all the faces staring at me, the same people who'd spent the entire evening discussing my failures and limitations like I wasn't even there. "I suppose I should explain," I'd said. "My name is Emma Anderson and I'm the founder and CEO of Anderson Global Logistics. We're the largest privately held supply chain management company in North America, with operations in 47 countries and annual revenue of $4.2 billion. The silence had been absolute. "The grocery store job Marcus mentioned? That's how I started. I worked nights at Safeway for 3 years while building my first distribution center during the day. I wanted to understand every aspect of food retail, customer behavior, inventory management, supply chain logistics, employee dynamics. Most executives learn this from consultants and spreadsheets. I learned it by scanning barcodes and stocking shelves." Derek's face had gone completely white. "We handle distribution for about 30% of the Fortune 500, I'd continued. "Walmart, Target, Kroger, Safeway. If you've bought groceries in the past 5 years, there's a good chance our systems got that food from farm to shelf. We revolutionized cold chain logistics for pharmaceutical companies, developed the algorithms that optimize delivery routes for Amazon's grocery division, and created the inventory management systems used by most major retailers." Mrs. Whitfield had been staring at me like I'd just announced I was from another planet. "You're the CEO?" "Forbes ranked me 47th on their list of richest self-made women," I'd said. "Though I prefer to focus on the fact that Anderson Global employs over 85,000 people worldwide and has been carbon neutral for 3 years running." Patricia had found her voice first. "Marcus, you said she worked at a grocery store." "She does." Marcus had looked like he was having trouble processing basic information. "She told me she worked in food retail." "Food retail logistics," I'd clarified gently. "I oversee supply chain operations for every major grocery chain in North America, plus expanding operations in Europe and Asia. When I said I worked in food retail, I meant I was revolutionizing how food gets from producers to consumers." Uncle Richard had been staring at his bourbon like it might provide answers. "The resume help I offered was very thoughtful," I'd said. "Though my current position is working out well." David had checked his watch. "Ms. Anderson, we really do need to leave. The Singapore call is critical, Chin Industries won't wait, and if we miss this window the merger could collapse. That's 18,000 jobs hanging in the balance." "Of course." I turned to Marcus and Patricia. "Congratulations again on your wedding. It was beautiful and I wish you both every happiness." "Wait," Marcus had grabbed my arm again, then immediately let go when David had shifted his weight. Emma, I don't understand. Why didn't you tell us? Why let us think? Tell you what? That I was successful? Would it have mattered? Of course it would have mattered. Really? Because based on what I overheard tonight, you all seemed pretty comfortable with your version of who I was. The family charity case. The one who needed financial help. The learning disabled sister who was too limited for real achievement. We never said you were learning disabled, Derek had protested weakly. You literally said that 20 minutes ago on the terrace, I'd replied. Along with speculating about my food stamp usage and expressing embarrassment about my car. Patricia's father had still been staring at me in shock. You actually run a billion-dollar company? She's on the Forbes list, someone had whispered from the back of the room. I turned to see one of the younger cousins holding up her phone. Emma Anderson, CEO of Anderson Global Logistics. Net worth estimated at $2.3 billion. The murmur that had gone through the room was like watching dominoes fall. This doesn't make sense, Aunt Susan had said, her voice almost accusatory. If you're so wealthy, why do you dress so modestly? Why do you drive an old car? Why live like a normal person? Because money isn't the most important thing in life, I'd said. I thought family was. I thought showing up for people you love mattered more than showing off your net worth. I thought being humble about success was a virtue. Marcus had been shaking his head. But you let us think you were struggling. I didn't let you think anything, Marcus. You assumed. You all did. You decided that because I didn't brag about my accomplishments at every family gathering, I must not have any. You created an entire narrative about my life, complete with financial problems I don't have and limitations I've never shown, without ever asking me a single direct question about what I actually do for work. But you said you worked in food retail, Patricia had protested. I said I worked in food retail logistics. When I mentioned supply chain management, you nodded politely and changed the subject. When I talked about hiring employees, you assumed I meant I was managing a grocery store department. When I said I traveled for business, you figured I meant training sessions at other locations. The room had been completely silent now, everyone processing the magnitude of their assumptions. You know what's funny? I'd continued. 3 years ago when I missed Christmas, you all decided it was because I couldn't afford the plane ticket. The truth is, I was in Tokyo, personally negotiating a contract that brought 2,000 manufacturing jobs back to the United States. Last year, when I couldn't make Derek's wedding, you assumed I was working extra shifts to make rent. Actually, I was in Germany opening our newest facility that now employs 1,500 people. Derek had looked like he might be sick. Ms. Anderson, David had interrupted gently, the helicopter. I'd nodded. I really do have to go. Singapore doesn't wait and there are a lot of people depending on this deal closing successfully. As I'd moved toward the exit, the room had parted around me like I was visiting royalty. The same people who'd been pitying me 5 minutes ago were now staring with a mixture of awe, confusion, and what I was pretty sure was embarrassment. At the door I turned back one last time. For what it's worth, Marcus, I hope you and Patricia are very happy together. Marriage should be about loving someone as they are, not as you assume they should be. Maybe that's something worth remembering. The elevator ride to the roof had been silent except for the soft jazz playing through the speakers. David had held the door for me as we stepped onto the hotel's helipad, where my pilot was waiting with the rotors already spinning. How was the wedding, ma'am? David had asked as he'd helped me into the helicopter, having to raise his voice over the noise. Educational, I'd replied, buckling my seatbelt and putting on the headset. As we'd lifted off, I could see people gathered on the hotel's lower terraces, looking up at the helicopter with obvious confusion. My phone was already buzzing with calls and texts, Marcus, Derek, Aunt Susan, numbers I didn't recognize. I'd turned off the phone and looked out at the city lights below. Tomorrow I'd be back to managing supply chains and board meetings and the 1,000 small decisions that kept a global company running smoothly. Tonight had been a reminder of why I kept those worlds separate. But maybe it was time to stop hiding who I'd become. Maybe the people who truly mattered would love me anyway, and the ones who didn't, well, perhaps their approval wasn't worth having after all. Singapore, ma'am? The pilot had asked through the headset. Actually, I'd said, let's make a quick stop at the office first. I want to change out of this dress. It's terrible and I have a feeling the Singapore meeting is going to be photographed. David had smiled. Yes, ma'am. I did mention that mustard yellow wasn't your color. As Seattle's skyline had grown larger ahead of us, I'd found myself actually smiling. Tomorrow's business news would probably mention Anderson Global's CEO making an unexpected helicopter exit from a family wedding. My PR team would field the inevitable inquiries about whether there was drama behind the departure. But tonight, for the first time in years, I felt completely free to be exactly who I was: successful, accomplished, and no longer willing to hide it to make other people comfortable with their assumptions. The funny thing was, I'd spent so much energy trying to be humble that I'd forgotten there was a difference between humility and invisibility. Maybe it was time to let the world, including my family, see what I'd actually built. After all, Anderson Global Logistics hadn't revolutionized supply chain management by staying quiet and hoping people would notice.